The year is 1840. The British Royal Navy's technologically advanced ships and weaponry defeated the Chinese forces. As a result, the Qing Empire recognized Britain as an equal and granted British subjects extraterritorial privileges in treaty ports. The British East India Company would be allowed to continue trading opium, leading to widespread addiction among the Chinese populace. The outcomes of the Opium Wars marked the beginning of significant foreign influence in China. How did international trade turn into a century of humiliation? The relationship between China and the Western world began in earnest during the Age of Exploration, when European powers were expanding their reach globally. In 1517, the Portuguese became the first Europeans to establish a presence in China. They were granted the right to anchor at the port of Macau in 1557, which they developed into a thriving trading post. The Portuguese introduced new goods and technologies, fostering initial trade relationships with the Chinese. However, these interactions were limited and strictly controlled by the Chinese authorities, who maintained a cautious stance towards foreign influence. The British East India Company emerged as a dominant force in the 18th century, eager to tap into the lucrative Chinese market. Initially, the British, like their European counterparts, faced strict trading conditions. The Qing Dynasty, ruling China, implemented the Canton system in 1757, which restricted all foreign trade to the port of Canton and confined foreign merchants to specific areas. This system also mandated that foreign traders operate through a guild of Chinese merchants known as the Kohong. The British were frustrated by these restrictions, but nonetheless engaged in the trade, exporting large quantities of tea, silk, and porcelain from China. This trade, however, was imbalanced, as the Chinese had little interest in British goods, leading to a significant outflow of silver from Britain to China. The early interactions between China and the West were not solely economic. They also included cultural and diplomatic exchanges. Jesuit missionaries such as Matteo Ricci played a crucial role in these early engagements. Arriving in China in the late 16th century, Ricci and his fellow missionaries introduced Western science, mathematics, and technology to the Chinese court. The Jesuits learned the Chinese language and adopted Chinese customs to gain the trust of the Qing rulers, facilitating a cultural exchange that enriched both civilizations. Despite these cultural exchanges, diplomatic relations were fraught with misunderstandings. The Chinese worldview, rooted in the tributary system, saw China as the Middle Kingdom, with foreign nations expected to pay tribute and acknowledge Chinese superiority. This clashed with Western notions of sovereign equality and international diplomacy. One of the most notable attempts to establish formal diplomatic relations was the mission led by Lord George Macartney in 1793. The British government, seeking to secure a permanent embassy in Beijing and negotiate more favorable trading conditions, sent Macartney to the Chinese court. The mission, however, was a failure. The Qing Emperor Qianlong viewed the British requests as demands for tribute and refused to alter the existing trade system. The encounter highlighted the profound cultural and diplomatic rift between China and the West. By the early 19th century, the tensions between China and the Western powers were escalating. The British East India Company, struggling with the trade imbalance, turned to opium as a solution. Opium, cultivated in British-controlled India, was smuggled into China in increasing quantities despite the Qing dynasty's efforts to ban the drug. The widespread addiction to opium had devastating social and economic effects on Chinese society, leading to mounting internal pressures. The Qing government, recognizing the threat, intensified its efforts to eradicate the opium trade, setting the stage for the conflicts that would erupt in the form of the Opium Wars. The immediate trigger for the First Opium War was the Chinese crackdown on the opium trade, particularly the actions taken by Lin Zexu, the imperial commissioner appointed by the Daoguang Emperor to end the opium crisis. In 1839, Lin Zexu arrived in Canton and implemented rigorous measures to suppress the opium trade. He ordered the confiscation and destruction of over 20,000 chests of opium which belonged to British merchants. Lin Zexu's strong stance against opium, including the imprisonment of British traders and a blockade of their trading enclave, was seen as a direct attack on British economic interests and national pride. The British government, influenced by pressure from traders in the East India Company, sought redress for what they considered illegal seizures and damage to British property. In response, the British government decided to take military action. Under the pretext of seeking reparations for the destroyed opium and protecting British commercial interests, Britain dispatched a naval force to China. In 1840, British warships arrived off the coast of China, marking the beginning of the First Opium War. The superior military technology and tactics of the British forces led to a series of decisive victories over the Qing forces, culminating in the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. This treaty imposed significant concessions on China, including the cession of Hong Kong to Britain, the opening of 5 treaty ports to foreign trade, and the establishment of extraterritoriality for foreign nationals. The Chinese government was reluctant to fully comply with the treaties, leading to friction with Western powers. The limited access to Chinese markets and the perceived disrespect for treaty obligations created a persistent undercurrent of tension. Western merchants and diplomats continued to push for expanded rights and greater access to Chinese trade, which the Qing Dynasty resisted. By the mid-19th century, Western powers were increasingly aggressive in their pursuit of colonial and commercial expansion. The Industrial Revolution had bolstered the economic and military capabilities of Western nations, fueling a desire for new markets and resources. China, with its vast population and resources, was a prime target for these imperial ambitions. Britain, in particular, was determined to secure greater influence in China. France and the United States also had similar ambitions, seeking to protect their interests and expand their influence. The Arrow incident was the primary spark for the conflict. The Arrow was a Chinese-owned, Hong Kong-registered ship suspected of piracy and smuggling. In October 1856, Chinese authorities boarded the Arrow while it was docked in Canton and arrested its crew, accusing them of piracy. The British consul in Canton protested, claiming the ship was under British protection and demanding the crew's release. The Chinese authorities eventually released the crew, but refused to apologize. The British used this incident to demand further concessions, escalating tensions. Around the same time, the execution of a French missionary in Guangxi province provided France with a pretext to join the conflict. The missionary, Father Auguste Chapdelaine, was accused of illegal proselytizing and executed by local Chinese authorities. France demanded reparations and joined Britain in seeking broader concessions from China. Both Britain and France used these incidents to press for broader demands. The Qing government's reluctance to meet these demands led to increased hostilities. In response to the Arrow incident and the Qing government's resistance to their demands, British and French forces launched military campaigns against China. The superior military technology and tactics of the Western forces led to a series of decisive victories. In 1858, the Qing government was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking, which granted many of the Western demands, including the right to establish legations in Beijing and the opening of additional treaty ports.